The exclusive club that once ran the global economy just lost half its power. So what happens when the world's biggest decisions are made outside the West?
It's a great question because this isn't some theoretical shift happening in the distant future. We're watching it unfold right now, a real-time remapping of global influence.
Exactly. Today we're doing a deep dive into the sources that detail this undeniable global power shift. For decades, you had the G7, that club of wealthy nations, the US, UK, Germany, Japan.
They called all the shots.
They called all the shots. But that club is, well, it's failing to command the stage, and it's creating this massive vacuum.
And that vacuum is being filled, and filled aggressively, by emerging powers, especially the BRICS alliance. This isn't an accident. It's being accelerated by geopolitical conflicts, the overuse of sanctions. And the result is dozens of nations are now actively trying to decouple from Western financial systems. It's like economic arithmetic has turned into geopolitical destiny.
And the numbers, the numbers tell the most compelling story. Let's look at the G7's financial footprint. Its share of global GDP, and this is measured by purchasing power parity.
Which is the crucial metric, yes. It gives you the truest picture of economic size.
It's plummeted. Today, it's at just 28.4%.
And to put that in perspective for you, that is a staggering decline. The G7 was about 50%, half of the global economy, back in the 1980s.
So they've lost half their financial dominance in just a few decades.
Gone. Meanwhile, you have this emerging BRICS group, now expanded with countries like Iran and the UAE, and they've just completely flipped the scoreboard.
They're now at 35% of global GDP, right?
35%, a clear economic lead over the G7. And then there's the human scale.
Oh, that's an even bigger gap.
A huge gap. BRICS accounts for an astonishing 45% of the world's population. The G7, a tiny 10%.
So our mission today is pretty clear. We are charting this new global economic landscape. We want to explain the loss of the West's economic muscle and the strategic rise of these new global poles. We have to understand not just that it's happening, but why it matters for everything from trade to global security.
Let's start with the G7's core problem, which is that they're basically resting on outdated prestige rather than current economic fact. It's not a slow slide. It's a structural collapse in relevance.
Okay, so you mentioned that collapse. What do the sources say is the fundamental reason the G7 members have lost so much ground so quickly?
Well, the sources are pretty clear that the G7's current share of the world's GDP is 29% lower than it was in the mid-1980s.
29%.
And that drop is driven mostly by the rapid industrialization growth in Asia, specifically China and India. The G7 just doesn't have that exclusive monopoly on manufacturing or technology that it once did.
So as one critic put it, they're a relic from a foregone time.
That's a great way to phrase it. And, this structural change makes the whole G7 title feel hollow. We actually saw Vladimir Putin highlight this when he questioned if the G7 even made sense economically anymore.
Right, I saw that. What was his point exactly?
Well, he had a very salient point if you just look at the raw data. He noted that India, which isn't a G7 member, is now the world's third largest economy in purchasing power terms.
Third largest.
While a traditional G7 member like the UK ranks much lower, somewhere around 10th, you can't claim to be leading the world when you're excluding economies of that scale. It's just untenable.
And that's just the economics. There's also a fundamental legitimacy problem, isn't there? The G7 is increasingly seen, especially by non-Western nations, as this self-serving Western club.
Exactly. When they get together to discuss global debt or climate or poverty, you have to remember they're speaking for only 10% of the world's population.
That lack of representation is exactly why we needed something like the G20, right? The G20 was basically born out of the 2008 financial crisis because everyone realized the G7 couldn't solve a global problem by itself.
That's it. The G20 immediately represented, 85 to 90% of world GDP and 2/3 of the world's population.
It had a mandate the G7 just couldn't claim to have. It was pretty much a formal admission of failure when even Barack Obama called the G20 the premier forum for global economic coordination.
And that raises an important framework for the listener. If the G7 is losing its economic might and its political mandate, you have to ask if we're entering what some analysts call a G0 world.
G0. What's that?
It's a situation where the old institutions, like the G7, can't really rule anymore, but nothing cohesive has actually emerged to take their place. A power vacuum.
That's a fantastic frame for this, because if the G7 is receding into that G0 vacuum, we have to look at what's trying to fill it. And that brings us to the BRICS alliance.
BRICS. or BRICS Plus as it's now called, with new members like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. It's a formidable alternative economic pole. You simply can't ignore it.
Let's just put those numbers out there one more time for you. BRICS Plus is at 35% of global GDP, officially surpassing the G7's 30%. And that demographic advantage, 45% of the world's population.
I mean, that's enormous consumer demand and labor supply. The G7's ability to impose global policy is just fundamentally constrained because it deliberately excludes these massive economies, most obviously China, the world's second largest economy.
You can't solve global supply chain issues or climate goals if China isn't at the table in a meaningful way.
It's impossible. And the ideology behind BRICS isn't just about money, it's political. Russia, for example, explicitly views BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or SCO.
Right, the STO. Just remind us what that is.
The SCO is sort of the Eurasian security counterweight to NATO. It's got a lot of influence in Central Asia. And for Russia, these groups together are the emerging power centers of the global south.
How is that an ideological push?
Well, from Russia's perspective, the world is moving away from a unipolar U.S.-led system, which is represented by the G7, and toward a multipolar world order.
So multiple centers of power.
Exactly. And they frame these geopolitical conflicts, these new alliances, as necessary steps. One source called it a campaign of national liberation against American hegemony. What that really means is they're just fed up with Washington setting all the rules.
So these alliances are forming out of strategic necessity, a desire for sovereignty, and I guess nothing has accelerated that faster than Western sanctions.
Precisely. The G7 sanctions, which were intended to cripple economies like Russia's, have had this massive boomerang effect. They've unintentionally pushed these non-Western nations closer together and strengthened their resolve to protect their own economies.
Right. The moment Russia got hit with the threat of being cut off from SWIFT, the global banking system, that must have sent a shockwave through a lot of capitals.
It created huge momentum inside BRICS to find a financial safe harbor somewhere away from the U.S. dollar. I mean, if your assets can be frozen overnight, you're going to stop relying on that system.
And this pivot away from the dollar isn't just talk, is it?
No, it's a concrete reality now. The sources show that countries like India and Russia are already conducting over 90% of their bilateral trade in their own national currencies. That's a tangible step that chips away at the dollar's dominance.
And sanctions, by creating instability, they also create opportunities for competitors. I think our reading pointed to China being able to act as a pioneer into difficult markets.
Yes, especially in Africa, where G7 countries had imposed restrictions, China stepped right in. It's a direct cost of using finance as a political weapon.
What's also fascinating is the pushback, the strong stance from countries like India against what they see as Western arm twisting.
India faced punitive tariffs from the U.S. for buying discounted Russian oil, something Washington obviously didn't like. But India held its ground. It asserted its sovereign right to trade with whoever it wants.
I remember that quote from President Putin we reviewed. He framed it as a defense of sovereignty, saying major players like India cannot be arm-twisted into submission.
And he added that India is a major global player, not a British colony. That kind of language tells you the era where Western powers could unilaterally dictate trade terms is it's over.
And this defiance is made worse by the perception that the G7 seems more focused on domestic politics than global coordination.
Totally. If you look at recent G7 summits, it often feels like political posturing for the voters back home, even if it hurts international consensus.
The 2017 Taormina G7 summit is the classic example of that dysfunction.
Or perfect example. President Trump was so reluctant to deviate from his domestic narrative, especially on the Paris Agreement, he just refused to join the consensus. The whole thing was portrayed as Trump versus the others.
And global progress was sacrificed for political points at home.
And you could see it in the results. The 2017 communique, the official summary, was less than 6 pages long. A massive failure compared to the 32-page version from the year before. Critics just called the group a waste of time, money, and effort.
And it's not just about one president. The sources point to a broader trend. The G7 gets heavily criticized for its weak response to debt crises in the global south, for failing on climate finance goals.
And NGOs have really weighed in on this. Groups like Oxfam and World Vision criticized the G7 for being absent without leave on major crises. They said there was no real commitment to addressing global starvation or disease.
That feedback really cements the view that the G7 is becoming more of a showcase for the world's richest countries than a real steering committee for the globe.
They're powerful, yes, but they are no longer decisive.
Which brings us to our final synthesis. I mean, the power shift seems undeniable. Economic reality BRICS surpassing the G7 in GDP, and just pure strategic self-interest are dissolving that old unipolar order. Nations are choosing their own path.
The key takeaway has to be that the G7's relevance is fading. Not just because others are growing, but because its own policy tools, like sanctions, are backfiring and forcing its competitors to innovate.
But wait, the sources also suggest that BRICS, while it's economically dominant, has some major internal friction. How stable is this new engine, really?
That is the critical nuance. The shift to a multipolar world is happening, but it is not smooth. It's messy. While BRICS is a powerful alternative, there are very real internal threats to its cohesion.
What kind of disagreements are we talking about?
Well, you have a split. Russia, China, and Iran are pushing for a strongly anti-Western course. They want aggressive de-dollarization, a clear challenge to the U.S.
Okay, so that's one camp.
But then you have a major founding member like India, which is deeply skeptical about abandoning the dollar entirely. India wants to maintain strategic autonomy, be non-aligned, trade with everyone, and do what's best for India.
And India and China have their own major geopolitical conflicts, border disputes.
Exactly. So China is the heavyweight trying to dominate the bloc, and India is pushing back.
So we're left with two fractured realities. You've got the exclusive Western club of the G7 that can't effectively govern anymore, but the emerging BRICS Plus pole is itself fractured by rivalry.
And this raises the final important question for you, the listener, to mull over. If the world is moving away from the G7, are we just entering a long-term G0 world, a world where no single country or bloc has the unified will or leverage to stabilize things and drive a truly coordinated international agenda? We've seen the power shift, but a clear leadership structure to replace it remains, well, deeply contested and very uncertain.